This message is brought to you by Spirion. The data privacy revolution is the new age of protecting what matters most. Automatically and persistently discover and classify sensitive data with the most accurate solution on the planet. Understand the data within the context of your business and then take actions to control that data so you can operate with minimal friction and comply with the laws and regulations built to protect the personal data privacy of individuals across the globe. This is Spirion, protecting what matters most. Visit them on the web at securityweekly.com/Spirion. The question is simple. Have any of the systems on my network been compromised? The answer is harder than it should be. Enter AI Hunter. Active Countermeasures has automated and streamlined techniques used by the best pen testers and threat hunters in the industry to create AI Hunter, a network threat hunting solution that does the first pass of a hunt for you to identify systems that are most likely to be compromised and scores the results on a scale from 0 to 100. You can then research those systems in depth with AI Hunter. Focus your valuable time on the systems that need your expertise with AI Hunter. Sign up for a personal demo today at securityweekly.com/ACM. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. Quick reminder to attend the RSA conference. If you haven't registered, it's almost too late by the time you hear this, but securityweekly.com/RSAC 2020. You can save $150. We'll be there. We hope to see you out there. Ian Coldwater is a grown teenage hacker turned lead platform security engineer at Heroku, specializing in hacking and hardening Kubernetes containers and cloud-native infrastructure, some of my most favorite topics, as well as capture the flag competitions. Ian, welcome to the program.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It is nice to have you, Ian. How did you get your start in information security?
Well, I started out doing DevOps and I started out getting a job at a tiny company that wasn't a tech company as a IT team of one, and had to automate a lot of things to keep myself from totally drowning since I was doing the job of 10 people. And after that company restructured, I had a pretty solid DevOps resume because I had made an entire pipeline for myself and set up kind of DevOps type structures. And after that, I started working on a DevOps team. I became the security SME on the team because they knew that I played capture the flags and had security interest and kind of some security experience. That place was very early Kubernetes adopters. And so as I was learning more about how to do this, people weren't really securing it yet or breaking it yet. And then people found the things that I was doing interesting. So I started public speaking about it, and then I did more of it. And after that, I started working as an independent penetration tester, specializing in Kubernetes environments and container security. And eventually I got snapped up by Salesforce, which is where I work now.
That's outstanding. I love the path because I'm old, and when I started, there was no such thing as there was like physical systems, and it's really hard for us older people that were racking and stacking physical systems to get into the new way in which infrastructure is maintained, built, and deployed. So that's really awesome that you were able to work with that stuff early on, which is just fantastic. So tell us a little bit about Kubernetes. Admittedly, Ian, we've been really light on our Kubernetes kind of discussions and coverage. So maybe if you can start with some of your kind of early experiences with Kubernetes and what it is, why you would use it, and what it means for security.
Sure. So Kubernetes is a container orchestrator. The idea is if you can do a fair amount with Docker and containers on its own, but if you're trying to do things at scale, certain things become really difficult. You have a lot of containers if you're trying to do a lot at the same time. Kubernetes allows you to orchestrate containers and deploy a lot of them in sort of logical ways. So I've heard it described as like the sane friend in the group text, the one who gets everybody to talk to one another and figure out where they're going. And it's a loosely coupled distributed system that does a lot that ordinarily would have to be done by various kinds of networking. It deals with DNS, it deals with proxying, it deals with load balancing, it allows for scaling up, scaling down, and deploying in an automated way. So you might want to use Kubernetes if you are using like microservice architecture, like container deployments, and you are running into the limits, which you will if you're trying to do a lot of them, of trying to automate them, trying to scale them, trying to put them together in a kind of sane way. So you might want to use Kubernetes in order to make your container life or your microservice architecture life easier to deploy your applications that way. Not everybody needs Kubernetes. It's very popular right now. But if you are just, putting the WordPress blog that you have 2 static pages for and you're running the server for in your basement, you might not need it. It might be engineering overkill, but you could try, I suppose.
But
Kubernetes is getting very popular in enterprises and big places that are needing to scale up more.
Tyler?
Yeah, so are there other orchestrators? Is Kubernetes kind of the de facto now based on community adoption, or is that more of a functionality standpoint?
That's a fantastic question. So there are other container orchestrators. Docker Swarm was one that people were using for a while, coming out of Docker. Mesosphere is one. Kubernetes originally came out of formed from Google's Borg and then got open sourced and given to the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. Kubernetes is by far the most popular of the container orchestrators at this point. It has had a really incredible rate of growth and adoption and a really active community contributing to it.
It sounds like I've done some stuff recently with Amazon's ECS. It sounds like that's kind of like their competing solution to Kubernetes. Is that a fair comparison or not? I don't know if you've worked with ECS before either.
So no, not quite. ECS is Amazon's container service. Amazon does have a managed Kubernetes offering, which is EKS. K for Kubernetes, and every public cloud has one. So there's AKS for Azure, there's GKE, your Google Kubernetes Engine for Google Cloud Platform. Kubernetes itself is just a platform, and different distributions, different clouds can offer their own version of Kubernetes. There's also commercial offerings like OpenShift from Red Hat. In and of itself, they call it like a platform for building platforms. So it's something to build things on top of.
Gotcha. So one of the things I'm wondering if Kubernetes helps you with sharing resources between different applications, right? Because one of the things that without Kubernetes, I feel like I struggle with certainly is storage, right? I don't know if Kubernetes makes that any easier, but does it allow you to maintain and share storage across multiple applications easier, or is it just a different way of thinking about storage in a Kubernetes environment?
That is a surprisingly complicated question. I think people have not entirely settled how to deal with stateful storage in a Kubernetes context, but it does allow you to share resources between applications, and there are storage solutions that can be used with it. One thing about Kubernetes is when I first started using it a few years ago, it was pretty small. It was a platform that you could actually learn end to end, and now there's a whole cloud native ecosystem surrounding Kubernetes. So there's different storage solutions that people can use depending on their needs and their use case.
Right. So with that big kind of adoption and push that happened so quickly, are you seeing a lot of the same kind of security issues that we've either dealt with or been looking at for the last 10 years within InfoSec or network security? Are those starting to resurface and we're having to kind of reinvent the wheel for this? Or is that entirely different set of problems that we're dealing with?
Yes. Yes, all of the above. So when I first started learning Kubernetes, there was very little security on it. You could, I'm actually not making this up, execute commands as root in a cluster with an unauthenticated curl call. You were supposed to put Nginx in front of it as a kind of firewall cert provider, but not everybody did. Kubernetes security itself has improved a lot, but their defaults are still pretty open. So a lot of things are still set to, for example, run as root or not necessarily have admission control on them in a way that is going to give you terribly secure defaults to this day. So it has been it's really improved a lot over the last few years. It's been a lot of sort of learning kind of the same lessons over and over as people had, but it's also a new set of lessons because the way that people have historically thought of, for example, network security is with like a perimeter firewall. And Kubernetes doesn't really work that way since it's all API based as a platform. So it's figuring out new ways to be able to speak to what security in a system looks like has been a thing I think that's kind of ongoing. And particularly with people who are kind of older school who have kind of very more traditional ideas about what constitutes the security of a system.
You can say antiquated. Go ahead.
I agree with Jeff's comment. I think it is antiquated thinking, in my opinion.
Jeff and I had a long conversation at B-Sides Orlando last year about trying to translate PCI into a container context, which I think has improved a lot in the past year.
Awesome.
Do you see a lot of
have
like
that conversation
enterprises that
again?
Sorry, Jeff, go ahead, bud.
I was going to say
I'll
we
see what
should have that
RSA, so we'll have to do it
conversation
there.
again. Yep. Okay.
So do you see a lot of like enterprise level organizations that do fall under some kind of compliance or governance starting to try to adopt Kubernetes as a solution to solve some of their scaling issues? Is that one of the big use cases that they're pushing for?
Absolutely, yeah. It really does shine at scale, at least up to a very large point. And yeah, a lot of people are trying to figure out right now in kind of larger enterprises in larger enterprises, a lot of places, to be real, are sort of still trying to figure out how to transition to the cloud itself. But in that process, they're trying to figure out how to make sure that it's PCI compliant and compliant with the other frameworks, that they're going to need to follow. And GKE, Google Cloud Platform, has put out a lot of good information about PCI compliance and how to get that working in GKE environments. That on the one hand is relatively specific to GKE, and on the other hand does have a lot of kind of more applicable advice to how to deal with it in other environments as well.
One of the common challenges that I've observed and both experienced is how to protect your secrets inside of a container environment of any kind. Ian's already snickering because this is a very common challenge, right? And people often get it wrong. But my question is, what is the best way to protect secrets? Secrets being, API keys, could be database passwords, all of the basically credentials you need to make your application work. We deem as secrets. How do you best protect those in Kubernetes? Is it native in Kubernetes, or do you really just recommend people go ahead and stand up a secrets manager either in their own cloud provider or as part of their application?
It's hardly something that has completely been settled. That's one thing about emerging tech is that, people figure it out as they go. I don't think it's been solved. The Kubernetes does have native secret handling. I would say it's pretty imperfect and not what I would recommend using in and of itself. HashiCorp Vault has a pretty good product. Also, especially historically, not necessarily perfect in the way that it handles secrets from end to end. But Vault recently put out a new version that does improve that a lot. So that's a pretty good product if people are looking for one thing to look at.
And they have an open source version, as does CyberArk's Conjure, correct?
They do. I am not familiar with CyberArk's product at all.
Gotcha. So inside of Kubernetes itself, there's a base 64 kind of encoded thing. It looked kind of sketchy to me. Is that what you're referring to?
There is the thing that will encode secrets into base 64. I would not use it by itself.
Gotcha. Okay. I was correct in some of my assumptions so far. Well, what are some of the other things that folks need to take into account if they're either just starting to implement a Kubernetes and are thinking about security? What are some of the major kind of areas to think about?
So Kubernetes by design, and historically, I think there are good reasons for this, although it isn't necessarily, this guy says hi, the way that I would have implemented it. Historically, Kubernetes on purpose has wide open defaults and allows for very, very granular control according to needs and use case. And in the beginning, when Kubernetes kind of target demographic was very experienced administrators, that I think was not as likely as it perhaps is now with greater use and adoption to lead to people just leaving it open out of the box and trusting that the defaults are going to be secure, because they're not. The defaults are wide open in Kubernetes on purpose by design. So I would say the first thing that people need to do is just know that they're not going to get secure Kubernetes out of the box. It's possible to make it a lot more secure, but you have to put some work into it. So you're going to want to make sure to use admission control, which admission control is a kind of umbrella term that includes things like node restriction and pod security policies, things like that, to make sure to really get your policies on point. because that is your line of defense in a lot of cases in a Kubernetes context against having people get into your cluster and be able to do all kinds of wild things that they would be able to do by default.
And sorry, Jeff, one question and then Jeff. So, but this all somewhat hinges on how securely you're building your containers, correct? That's still a step to build your containers securely, then bring them to Kubernetes and have them managed and deployed securely, correct?
You're not wrong. And container security is it's a holistic thing because containers share resources with each other and with their hosts. Mm-hmm. So any given container security setup is only going to be as secure as the containers in it, the applications in those containers, the orchestrator, the container runtime, the host that they're on, the operating system they're on, the silicon itself. You can't think of it as it being one piece that you can secure and be good to go. It's the whole stack.
Yeah.
So you're right. You don't want to put your vulnerable applications in your containers. It can lead to compromised containers, which can lead to getting access to the rest of the cluster, especially if you don't have admission control on it, because then there's not anything stopping you from moving laterally in any given direction.
And I think the first realization of that is that most of the containers that I was using from Docker Hub were just coming out of the box insecure. I was like, I just need to build it myself, because as I learned, I'm like, this is not going to end well. So, yeah.
Yep. And a lot of Docker containers are, built to run as root and, are built with all of the privileges turned on. And so there are definitely pitfalls and there are a lot of moving parts. It's a big, complex distributed system. So it's possible to, they all have to be configured. They're easy to misconfigure. It's possible to do it well, but it takes some work.
Yeah, agreed. Jeff?
Well, you were kind of going where I was going to go, Paul, just sort of thinking about, the application of, as you're describing, Kubernetes as a platform. It's not the thing in and of itself. You're using it with other things, and I was going to ask, and Paul sort of asked the same question, which was, how much do you have to rely on the security of the things that you're now trying to manage with, or deploy more efficiently with Kubernetes, and not sort of fall into a false sense of security, if you will, thinking, well, Kubernetes will just, add a layer. What I'm hearing you say is it doesn't, out of the box, add any type of layer of security without intent, which is kind of what we were talking about, back at B-Sides Orlando. I don't know if it's a proper analogy, but it's reminding me of the early days of desktop and servers, where the push to get that new technology out the door was to have everything open and enabled, sort of plug and play is what we used to call it. And we spent several years in the security community figuring out ways to just shut everything down and secure everything. And now, like we talked about Microsoft a couple weeks ago, where they've come a long way in terms of what is built into the operating systems today. There's so much more secure just out of the box. Maybe not a perfect analogy, but it certainly sounds a lot like it from what you're describing.
I really think it works, honestly, in a lot of ways. As the cloud native ecosystem has, been coming along and growing, a lot of things are designed for speed, for velocity, for getting things up and running. Literally, the sort of canonical book that came out about Kubernetes is called Kubernetes Up and Running. And that has really helped it gain that rapid rate of adoption and the velocity of growth that it has had. But you're right, it's sort of the same set of problems again of like, okay, everybody's adopting things, but people are adopting things that are very open. And then there's this sort of pendulum of like, okay, now we have to figure out how to secure these things that everybody is adopting and putting out onto the internet. So it is some of learning the same lessons over again. And part of it, I think, it doesn't entirely help that a lot of the people who learned about it the first time around have a lot of feelings about DevOps, and that there's not necessarily a lot of communication all of the time between the kind of older guard Linux sysadmins and the newer kind of DevOps folks coming up from being developers who are learning this stuff again.
I agree. And I think another piece that bears some discussion is that your container registry is separate from your Kubernetes, correct? It's yet another piece that you have to build and secure, as well as your containers, and then implement Kubernetes, correct?
It's really true. Yeah. And, and then there are the layers of the container build process itself. Mm-hmm. And, it's kernels all the way up and turtles all the way down, right?
Yep.
I also have to
ask.
The
code in GitHub either.
But Tyler brings up another important piece in when we say DevOps and a CI/CD pipeline also includes, largely Git, right? But any kind of version control system is not only where you store your code, but it's also where you store the scripts and other things that are how you build and deploy your environment. So that is another very critical piece of this puzzle.
It's true. And, because Kubernetes is configured by YAML, its configuration as code, that is a layer of it as well. Software supply chain is, like, security is a thing that I think a lot of folks in kind of the cloud native ecosystem are doing a lot of thinking about right now. And folks at GitHub and various other places are, Google Cloud Platform put out a thing pretty recently called Beyond Prod, which is a white paper that was really good, talking about how to think on kind of locking down the supply chain a little bit. It's important. My coworkers at Heroku just put out an open source thing called Terrier, like the dog. And it's that's about container signing, and that's great. And I totally recommend checking it out.
Sweet.
All right, I want to digress and just simply ask, who is the special guest that we have joining us every now and then?
There's actually two of them. One of them is named Ash and one of them is named Spark, and they look identical, and I'm not sure if both of them are only one of them who've been on so far.
Okay.
But getting back to the main discussion, I find it fascinating that, more or less, generally speaking, in the world that we live in, I think there's a belief that as technology advances, security is solved, and it just keeps smacking me in the face as we're talking about it. This just seems like a huge step backwards in terms of, if there was a lesson to take away from all this, or a message to take away from all this, it's, buyer beware. Don't be fooled into thinking that this particular new brand of technology is advanced in terms of security. In that context, are there, a top 3 or 5, or like the first 3 or 5 things that somebody should look at in terms of considering securing their environment, securing the Kubernetes that they're trying to employ?
Okay, 2 things. I guess on the one hand, I can absolutely see how it could sound that way and how what I'm saying could sound that way, but I'm not sure that it's 100% true, that it's entirely a step backward. I think people are doing really interesting work right now with container isolation, with hardware attestation, with like trying to figure out how to make kind of cloud environments more tenable in terms of how to secure them, especially in like multi-tenant environments. And a lot of this work is really great. It's just, you can't assume that if you just set up your Kubernetes cluster out of the box, it's going to be secure. But there are people who are doing really interesting work right now that I think has gone beyond the work that has been done in the past about how to make more secure cloud environments in general. In terms of the first things to look for, like I said before, you want to make sure that you have admission control on there. If you are, every set of Kubernetes defaults and every installation is going to be a little bit different. So if you're on a public cloud, make sure that you are going according to the recommended guidelines for that particular cloud. The Kubernetes CIS benchmarks are a really good resource for getting an idea of like what the recommendations are for best practices. They redo them with every version and they're decently up to date. So I believe there are also ones for individual cloud providers at this point. So those are worth taking a look at and making sure that your cluster is, looking to that. It doesn't have to be a hard and fast set of rules, but as a standard of like how to do things well. Make sure you have your admission control on, make sure you have your resource quotas and your node restrictions set, and maybe look into things like Gatekeeper or Open Policy Agent for kind of setting up the policies around how to secure that environment. There are policies that can hook into IAM if that's something that is a part of a system that you're using, that can make that much more helpful and easier for people to do. So yeah, I would say just, get your admission control on point, make sure that you're reading the guidelines for how to secure and harden it well, and then get on that.
I think it really comes down to the basic notion of trust and how that is applied to this newer environment where we talked about you've got a source code repository, you've got your containers, you've got Kubernetes in deployment. I think the one piece we might be missing is kind of your deployment technology like Jenkins or Circle CI, because that's independent of Kubernetes as well, correct?
It is. Yeah, and definitely has some potential security holes if you are not careful with it.
Yeah, and then how you trust basically applied network and storage and applications and how all those things are trusted. That's more inside of Kubernetes, correct?
A lot of it is, yeah. So there will be different ways of setting up your network within Kubernetes, and there are different kind of technologies and ways that you can help to do that in the most secure way. I've been really excited about Cilium recently, which uses the eBPF layer to add an extra element of network security that the other CNIs, which are container networking interfaces, aren't really doing. So that's super cool and allows you to get more visibility into what's happening on that layer than I think previous things had been able to give to people.
Yeah, and Sysdig has open source and others that use the BPF technology as a security mechanism.
Yes. Falco does a slightly different thing than Cilium does, because one is a CNI on the network layer, and one is kind of giving you visibility into things that are sort of happening in and around the cluster. So Falco will let you know things like, a shell got popped here, or like this got opened here. But they're similar technology on the bottom end, different things kind of on the higher layers. But while I'm on the subject of the bottom end, the thing about, when Jeff was like, it seems like a lot of this stuff is just the same tech. It's important to know when you're talking about containers that containers are not a thing, like they're not an actual box. They're just Linux primitives. And so a lot of it seems like maybe intimidating or like a shiny new wrapper on something that might be new, but a lot of it is just a shiny new wrapper on the same old tech. And so if you understand Linux well on the low levels, it can be easier to figure out how to be able to operate and secure containers in Kubernetes.
I love that containers are Linux primitives. That was very well said. Doug and then Tyler.
So maybe you'll agree with me on this. I was talking about this recently to somebody, and there was a problem with mainframe. Speaking of old guys, there was a problem with mainframe, which was the idea that it's really two separate problems. And I was talking about Kubernetes the same way. Somebody asked me to explain what it was, and I was talking about be very careful that you don't assume that just because someone can install and operate something, that they can also secure it. Yeah. Because there's two different the mainframe went through the same exact problem. We had mainframe operators who were system engineers who were specialized.
We used to call them priests.
Yeah, something. Yeah, I called them priests. Then there was that whole thing with the priests, and I backed away from that. But no, I'm not going to go there. But the idea that the mainframe operator was going to also then have to take on the task of securing the mainframe was where people got in vast amounts of problems, because there's different expertise. And I felt like that Kubernetes is a lot like a mainframe in that it's this bubble that's managing other bubbles, and you have to be very careful that the engineering solution, which is to make things work, is not also and you can also at the same time make sure it's safe. You really got to make sure you separate those tasks and keep people focused on the task they're supposed to do. And that's why you need that security engineer looking at Kubernetes at the same time that engineer is looking at making Kubernetes work. And I know not everybody can afford to do stuff like that, but that was the mainframe problem that I kept seeing when security first became an issue as we started bolting mainframes onto like networks.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's why we do segments such as this, so that we can elevate the knowledge of the security folks to be able to apply what we know about security to this new technology.
Ironically, perhaps, Kubernetes is now available for z/OS. So some of those mainframe engineers may also get to actually use Kubernetes in the nearest future.
That's really cool.
I think they'll find it very familiar.
I think so too. Yeah. Tyler?
So does Kubernetes have, like you were saying, this is a very similar to Linux. You're just a primitive Linux kind of orchestrator at this point. Does that apply to the logs that those containers and the orchestrated containers are therein being pushed out to? Like, how do you obtain good visibility? We were just talking with Elastic, for example. Are there good Beats integrations for Kubernetes or the containers therein?
Yes, there are.
The answer is it's complicated, okay?
Which is the command line interface for Kubernetes, has a kind of built-in logging. There are various kind of things in the ecosystem that will allow for more robust logging and more robust visibility. I made that face because this is fairly out of my wheelhouse, but it does exist. I've seen it. There was a really fantastic keynote at KubeCon this last time from the Open Telemetry project, which was pretty sweet. And like I said, Cilium's pretty good. Sysdig Falco is a really good product. And I don't know that I can give you the definitive answer on Kubernetes observability, just because it's just not the thing that it's not the thing that I do, but certainly those things exist. And
one thing I noticed in the container configuration that transferred over to when I did the ECS deployment was that I was tuning my containers to send all of their logs to standard out. And when I did that, basically Amazon AWS tools were able to then capture it. If I send it to a log file, like, it was kind of just lost forever in this particular deployment. Every deployment's different, but a lot of times you're changing the configuration of all of your applications and your containers to send the logs to standard out so that it can be centralized wherever you're orchestrating and running your containers. Is that a thing, Ian?
Yeah, sure. I imagine it could be. A lot of the clouds will also have kind of their own individual container logging solutions. Like EKS uses GuardDuty, which I think CloudTrail logs is what feeds into it, which will let you know about kind of configurable things that you might want to know about. GKE has Stackdriver. A lot of what I know about Stackdriver involves the fact that in a week we're going to be doing an exploit on it, but it does exist and you can use it, and it's not bad. Mostly.
So before anybody else takes this, I really want to hop in, and can you give us kind of some insight around some of the offensive mindset and offensive capabilities and exploits and tooling that you're currently leveraging for Kubernetes?
Yeah. So in terms of mindset, a lot of it is just sort of kind of how to attack anything. You sort of go in and try to figure out, is it a black box? Is it a gray box? Is it a white box? Like, figure out what's going on, what's running in there, what the configurations are like, what the context is, both figuratively and literally, because Kubernetes contexts are a thing. Figure out if there's anything in there that could potentially be vulnerable, try to get a foothold, maybe get the foothold, figure out where you can move from there. And that in a lot of ways doesn't look that different than pen testing anything else. However, it helps a lot to understand how Kubernetes works, kind of on the networking levels and both on the lower levels, and sort of just generally how to get around in a cluster and like what it is that you're looking at and looking for. And I think a lot of folks who pen test Kubernetes who are less familiar with those environments can run into trouble with that, just because it doesn't necessarily work in the same way that like a more typical network might in a lot of cases. In terms of like kind of the state of the art, I'm really excited to be doing a talk at RSA with Brad Giesemann next week, because what we're going to be talking about is kind of like newer Kubernetes attacks that people haven't really covered before, and the kind of things that somebody who has really deep knowledge of Kubernetes as a platform might be able to do. So I'm not going to entirely spoil it, but definitely check out our talk in a week. And generally speaking, there's, a lot of the newer stuff, I think that I feel excited about for attacking Kubernetes and Kubernetes context is you used to be able to really depend on people setting their stuff up very badly. And it was pretty easy to attack in some cases because people just didn't have security on their stuff, or in some cases it wasn't possible for them to. And now I think we all have to level up a little bit because the defaults are still not secure, but they're a lot better than they used to be. And so now you have to be able to have some kinds of understandings of like Linux primitives and like kernel exploits and things like that in order to be able to more reliably attack something well. But in a lot of cases, like you also just have to know how Kubernetes works well, because there are a lot of things that are not vulns, but are extremely exploitable, like host path as a volume mount exposes the file system, and especially in combination with something like an exposed Docker socket, very easily allows you to not only gain control of the cluster very quickly, but to gain control of the underlying node. So it's awesome. Know it well, know the platform well, know the underlying low levels well.
So if someone was to start, like want to get started with Kubernetes, both from the offensive or the defensive side, what would you recommend as far as a good starting point?
Yeah, do you install it locally? Do you put it in the cloud? Like, what's the best way to learn it? It's a great
good
question.
Resources, websites, books.
Absolutely, yeah. If you're just trying to learn Kubernetes, period, Kubernetes Up and Running came out with a second edition not too long ago. It's pretty good. It's a book. Kelsey Hightower has a repo called Kubernetes the Hard Way, which allows you to bootstrap a cluster from scratch. And that can give you a pretty good understanding of how to set up a cluster and like what's happening there under the hood. In terms of defending it, as I said, the Kubernetes CIS benchmarks are a pretty good place to start in terms of like getting those best practices on point. And in terms of attacking it, there was a really amazing workshop at KubeCon this last time in San Diego in the fall. And I believe that the link is something like securingkubernetes.com. I'm always going to get it wrong, but it's along those lines. And if you look up Securing Kubernetes KubeCon workshop, it was really elaborate and it was great. And I got to be a room helper for it and watch 400 people escape their first container at the same time, and it was pretty much the best. So it's online. You can walk through it. They set it up on GKE and have a tutorial, ask for how you can set it up, and it was amazing. And I really recommend that one.
Yeah, I was going to say it's almost like someone should set up a vulnerable by default Kubernetes environment that you can just keep rebuilding. It sounds like someone's already done that.
Yeah, and I think more people are working on things like that with time also.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, it's great to have training environments for all that kind of stuff, and as you see them get developed, it really helps people improve, because sometimes people do things because they don't know any better, and then they start trying to fix it, and it causes more problems, and yeah.
It's better to do it in a lab. Have a lab where stuff is set up vulnerable and you can see.
That's why I like having a lab.
Right? You can see how it's exploitable, right? So that when you go build it in production, you're like, oh, no, I can't do that because I know that there's an exploit for it.
Yeah. I think it's securingkubernetes.com or it's securekubernetes.com. It's whichever one I think it is that it isn't, but it's one of the two, I'm pretty sure. I will tweet it out after I get off of this thing.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
So
Lee.
So with all the, we've got environments to see how to escape a container, and all your recommendations for securing Kubernetes and containers. Where's the challenges lie in terms of this universe versus the old farts like me who are trying to understand and that it's not evil and gonna bring the end to peace as we know it. I mean, where is there still a gap there, or is there an aid for that, or you think that the knowledge is transferring?
I think there is, in a lot of cases, still kind of a gap there. And one thing that I try to do personally is try to get people to talk to one another and understand that, like, we're working toward the same goals. We want secure products. We want, we want the same things in a lot of cases, and just getting people to understand each other, I think, is really important. one thing for the kind of like older school sysadmins to understand is that containers aren't entirely new, that if they understand Linux and Linux administration, they're actually much farther ahead for understanding how containers work and how to secure them than they think, because containers are just like the evolution of like old school zones and jails and like shroots, you know? If you understand how those things work, you're actually pretty far along the continuum of understanding how containers work. And if you understand how to secure Linux well, you're actually pretty decently far along to understanding how to secure containers well. And that is the case on the breaker end too. If you understand how to like break low-level Linux, you're actually pretty well situated to understand how to escape and break containers. So understanding the commonalities that those things have is, I think, huge, because it also breaks down some of the barriers for thinking that those things are like new and scary and impossible, because they're not. It's a lot of more of the same things in some ways, and they're not always the same implementations, or like the architecture isn't always the same. But that barrier to entry, I think, can feel not as daunting if you understand the things that those things have in common.
I'd love to see resources on this topic, because having been the old school sysadmin and now working in these newer environments, if we look at something like file system security, like Ian was saying, some of those things do apply, but now we're talking about volumes, and it's file system security is a very different way of thinking about the way you would secure a file system, because it's a volume, and there's a lot of different ways to create and secure a volume. I think it's the same thing on the network side. We think of firewalls, whether they're local or network, that those concepts exist in container environments today, but it's slightly different, right? In different ways of thinking about it. There's almost like a conversion kind of class where you can walk someone through traditional file system security and then talk about how that would apply to container environments. Ian, do you kind of agree with the kind of conversion process?
I think that definitely can be a thing. I mean, in a lot of cases, like containers are made of C groups and namespaces, right? So like a lot of the ways that like namespacing happens are pretty directly applicable from the way that, you know, you might understand namespaces in a Linux context. It just, you know, like it's that extra hop that's not entirely conversion. It's like, okay, so here's this much understanding here, and then here's the way you have to understand about how this is implemented here. But a lot of it, like I said, isn't really that different. A couple of really good talks that I can think of off the top that are helpful to people trying to understand this. I've shown Alice Goldfuss's talk, The Container Operator's Manual, to a lot of kind of older school sysadmins trying to figure out how that works. And that I think that's been one that people have found really helpful. And on the breaker end, there was a talk at Black Hat last summer, not mine, called a compendium of container escapes that explains containers on the lower levels and how they can be escaped and exploited, that I think is going to have a lot of kind of language and terminology that's going to sound possibly surprisingly familiar to a lot of people who are familiar with either low-level administration of Linux or breaking it.
Was that was Brandon or Brendan from...
Brandon Edwards.
Brandon Edwards. What is the company that he works for?
Capsulate.
Thank you. Yeah. We interviewed him just after his Black Hat talk. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I'd also recommend, not to plug a former amazing person, Mr. J. Bill, but Attacking and Defending Kubernetes. He has made the jump from the Linux side of that and kind of really jumped on and adopted a lot of the kind of conversion of correlating Linux and a lot of the attacks he's seen over the last 2 decades to Kubernetes from the Linux piece of that. Yeah, I think it was his DEF CON last year. He had Attacking and Defending Kubernetes, if I remember right.
Yeah, I think there needs to be a lot more information sharing and resources like this made available, and making awareness that these resources do exist. I will say, I think there is a much better opportunity to apply security to containerized environments, to use a very generic term, than in more traditional systems.
Yeah.
Everyone agree with that?
I agree.
From what I've seen so far.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's, as I said, I really like emerging tech. Like, to me, it's really fun to get to kind of like figure out how to do things that people haven't quite figured out how to do yet. And there's so much territory and so much opportunity for like growth and figuring out how to do it and how to make it better, that like if people are excited about like helping move that forward, like there's so many ways to do that. And one thing I want to encourage people to do is also get involved in the Kubernetes project, because it's open source and we are always looking for more security-minded contributors. That I think is a really helpful thing that can be done to help move that project forward.
I would also say, whether you're on the attack or defense side, that building and standing up this infrastructure on your own is something you're going to want to do. Like, yes, you can stand up a registry in Amazon, right? And it's, you know, a couple of clicks and, hey, look, I've got a registry. But build one on your own, right? I think the same thing with containers. Build them yourself. The same thing with Kubernetes. Build it all yourself first. That's going to provide you a great foundation of knowledge. Agreed?
It really is. I definitely recommend that folks like figure out how to do that. Like I said, Kubernetes up and running is fantastic. If you are running it in production, there is an argument that you might have a somewhat easier time if you're using something managed, because it can be a hard thing to configure in and of itself. But when you're learning, I think that's huge.
Yeah, in your lab, stand it up on your own, right? Don't
stand it up on your own in production.
Don't go to production like I did and stand up Docker with a registry and then realize you left the API exposed to the internet. Not that we did. Okay, we did that, but we learned a valuable lesson about that. But you gain foundational knowledge by building it yourself. But to Ian's point, don't do that in production. You're much better to do it in.
I don't see how you can begin to secure this stuff if you haven't built it up. I mean, yeah, you can do best practice steps, but I mean, you're not going to understand the underlying problems if you haven't screwed it up a couple of times yourself.
Yeah.
In the lab.
In the lab.
Or in production. You'll learn faster and more expensively.
I mean, we've all been there, right?
We've all been there.
Have you seen any automated tools that are either kind of correlating or scanning for these particular kind of misconfigurations? Things like S3 bucket misconfigurations or Shodan, where they're looking for specific kind of Kubernetes artifacts, for lack of a better word there. That's kind of looking for vulnerabilities and offering an attack surface for people that are kind of deploying these in production.
Yeah, several. There's Aqua Security has a bunch of them that look for. They have a few different ones. They look for various things. There's one called Kube Hunter that will kind of point out what it sees as like misconfigurations or potential vulnerabilities in your cluster context. There's a newer one I'm super excited about called K-Rail, which comes out of Cruise, that is made for engineering teams. So you can, that's designed to work with them and like let them know about potential problematic things in a cluster context, either from kind of misconfigurations to just like straight up vulns. So yeah, I would say check out Aqua's products. There are several of them that are really solid, and K-Rail I've been liking a lot too. There's another one called KubeSec, which is decent, but I recommend running it locally, because if you aren't running it locally, you're sending all of your YAML to somebody else, and that is not ideal.
Yeah, and these are tools that are looking specifically inspecting your configuration, not scanning in the traditional sense over the network. Like I use HatoLint to look at my Docker files, but it's looking at my configuration, not necessarily scanning my running containers. Correct?
Yes, but there are also ones that will scan your running containers as well. Aqua just came out with one. There's one from former Core OS called Claire.
Yes, I've seen Claire before.
And yeah, they're definitely out there.
Are you seeing any big like bug bounty or like exploit dev where a lot of this kind of initial research is being pushed or deployed by large companies?
Can you clarify the question?
Like bug bounties for Kubernetes specifically. Are you seeing any of that like start to pop up and populate as far as from the offensive side, where exploits are either being sold or bugs are being submitted to companies that are either running Kubernetes or directly to Kubernetes?
Got it. Okay, so Kubernetes itself actually has a new bug bounty program as of a couple months ago, and that is just getting up and running. And in terms of before that came around, There have been a couple of big bug bounties relating to Kubernetes. One was Weight Watchers, I believe, had one. Shopify had a really big one. There was one, I think Snapchat had one, and those were in the like 25K range. So there have been a couple of like big splashy Kubernetes bounties that have happened in the last couple of years. There have been less of those to my knowledge more recently, because some of the, how do I put this? It is less easy now than it was in 2017 to find somebody's thing on Shodan and just be able to walk in and get root on it. A lot of that has been somewhat buttoned up. And I'm not saying that those systems don't still exist out there, but it's not, I think, as easy to find. And now I think in order to exploit Kubernetes well, you have to put in somewhat more work. And so I think right now, I'm absolutely positive that people are doing exploit development in relation to this stuff right now, but it has, I don't know. I haven't seen as many of those outside of the Kubernetes bug bounty in a minute. That doesn't mean that there won't be another one tomorrow.
It sounds like now we need to do or attackers also need to do the research to be able to compromise a Kubernetes environment, whereas before it was just really lack of controls and you could just really just walk right in, right?
Yeah, and I'm excited about that as an attacker. It's fun to get to learn and to get to level up. And I'm excited about the talk we have coming up where we're talking about how to kind of attack things in this new environment with a relatively more secure paradigm.
That's awesome. Any other questions for Ian?
Do you think that Kubernetes or container hacking lab will become a common thing, or is it going to become by the wayside because people are raising the bar?
I think that as Kubernetes gains rapid, more adoption, as it grows more, as more people begin to use it, there will be more demand coming up, both from attackers trying to figure out how to break it because it's all over the place, so many enterprises use it, and from defenders who are now being tasked to try to set this thing up and secure it. So I don't think that learning labs or environments are going anywhere anytime soon. I think probably people are, if anything, more wanting to learn this stuff now than they were when they hadn't heard of it yet.
Awesome. Great opportunity.
I'm excited.
Ian, when is your talk at RSA? Do you know the day and the time? Friday
morning at 8:30 a.m. and it conflicts with Katie Musaris's and Weld Pun's keynote, which is unfortunate. But that's when it is. I'm doing it with Brad Giesemann, and I'm really excited about it. I think it's going to be great. We'll be doing it again at KubeCon in Amsterdam too.
Fantastic. Ian, thank you so much for appearing on Paul's Security Weekly.
Thank you for having me.
Are we not doing 5 questions?
Oh, I forgot about 5 questions.
5 questions.
How did I forget about 5
How did you forget that?
He was drunk.
No,
distracted by the cat.
I'm not. I was distracted by the cat.
Yes, you.
So, Ian, 5 questions with Security Weekly. Are you ready to play?
Let's play.
3 words to describe yourself.
Small, bouncy, and resilient.
If you were a serial killer, what would be your weapon of choice?
Wits.
If you wrote a book about yourself, what would the title be?
This story doesn't sound believable to me either.
In the popular game of Ask Grabby Grabby, do you prefer to go first or second?
I'm not familiar with this game.
It's an acceptable answer. Choose 2 celebrities to be your parents.
Alive, dead, fictional, or otherwise?
Live or dead?
Any
Live
you
or
want.
dead,
Fictional, otherwise. No rules.
Fictional
I would love to
not.
grow up in the Addams Family. They seem like they had a pretty good gig.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Ian, thank you so much for appearing on Paul's Security Weekly. And our listeners, make sure if you're attending RSA that you attend the talk. Very important. Friday morning, 8:30. Thank you. With that, we will take a short break, come back with the security news for this week. Stay tuned.